Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. So, let us continue with the respiratory system in which we were discussing about the respiration. Okay, so, we have seen that the respiration basically involves the exchange of gases. Okay, now basically over the exchange of air takes place, okay, and in the meantime the exchange of gases will also occur. Okay, so it involves three main processes. The respiration, it involves the three processes, that is the pulmonary ventilation, which we have covered in the earlier videos. So, ventilation is the exchange of air between the alveoli of the lungs and the atmosphere. Okay, so, it involves the processes of inhalation and exhalation. So, we have seen exactly what are the mechanisms of the inhalation and the exhalation. So, as this air is entering into the alveoli, it is carrying in the oxygen which is taken up by the blood which is present in the pulmonary capillary. So, here the exchange of gases is involved. Okay. So, this is the first place where the exchange of gases is taking place. Apart from that, even the exchange of gases takes place at the tissue level also, we have seen. So, that there are two types of respiration which are taking place. This process of exchange of gases is known as respiration. So, it takes place in the lungs, so it is known as the pulmonary respiration, or it is also known as the external respiration, and the one which takes place at the tissue level, wherein oxygen is taken up and carbon dioxide is given up to the blood. That process is known as tissue respiration or internal respiration. Okay, so, we are going to deal with this exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at these two levels. Okay, now before going into the actual process of exchange of gases, how exactly it is taking place, or why it takes place, why the oxygen moves from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries, and why the carbon dioxide moves out. There should be some reason for that, right? Or at the tissue level, why the oxygen, it moves from the systemic capillaries into the tissues, and why the carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. There should be some reason why it takes place, right? So, before going into these actual process of exchange of gases, we will deal with the basic process and the reason why it is taking place. Okay, so, these exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide which takes place between the alveolar air and the pulmonary blood, it takes place via process of passive diffusion. So, I need not discuss much about this process, passive diffusion. So, you are all aware about this particular process, passive diffusion, isn't it? Movement of the substance across the membranes, it takes place by a number of processes. Some are passive, some are active. Passive word, what does it imply? The word passive? Yes, it indicates that energy, is it required over here? No, it is not required. Okay, so, in this particular process, energy is not required. And what is the meaning of diffusion? It is a movement of any substance across the membrane through the lipoidal layer. Now, how it will take place or why it is taking place? It will depend upon the concentration gradient, right. So, any substance moves from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. So, that is what you all must have studied about this particular process of passive diffusion. Okay. So, this particular process of passive diffusion for these gases, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, it depends upon the behavior of these gases in a particular manner. So, these can be understood with the help of these two laws, Dalton's law and Henry's law. Okay, so, Dalton's law, it will help you in understanding how the gases move down their pressure differences by diffusion. Remember, process of diffusion, it moves from area of high concentration to lower concentration, but now here it is a gas, right. So, there must be a pressure difference, because gases, they exert a particular pressure, and the Henry's law, it will help you to understand how the solubility of a particular gas relates to its diffusion. So, in turn, the diffusion will be dependent upon the solubility in a particular fluid. So, these particular gases will be entering or getting dissolved into the body fluids. Blood is a body fluid, right. Also, it has to enter the tissues. So, it has to get dissolved into the interstitial fluids, then it will move towards the cells. So, these two laws will make it very clear why this movement of gases is taking place in a specific direction and up to what extent the movement is taking place. Okay, so, these laws are known as the gas laws, the two laws, that is the Dalton's law and the Henry's law. Now, coming to the Dalton's law. Now, what does this law states? It states that in a particular mixture of gases, each gas exerts its own pressure as if no other gas were present, which means that in a particular mixture of gases, say 5 gases are mixed together. So, each gas will exert its own pressure as if no other gas was present. Individually, it will exert its own pressure, and that will be characteristic to that particular gas. Okay, so, this pressure which a particular gas in a mixture exerts, that is known as the partial pressure. Partial pressure. Why partial pressure? Because each gas is exerting its own pressure, right, and it is a mixture of gas. So, the sum total of the partial pressures of all the gases will be equal to the total pressure which is exerted by that mixture, right. Okay, so, this partial pressure, it is denoted as Px. Now, this subscript X indicates the name of the gas, the chemical formula of that particular gas. Okay, so, how you will determine the total pressure exerted by the mixture? Just by adding all the partial pressures which are exerted by the individual gases. Say for example, the atmospheric air, let us take an example, that is the best example, atmospheric air. It is a mixture of gases, right, a number of gases like your nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, also water vapor, and a few other gases are present in very small quantities. And what is atmospheric pressure? You are all aware of atmospheric pressure, right? That is 760 millimeters of mercury. So, what will be, how you will calculate this atmospheric pressure? It is the pressure of the atmosphere, right? An atmosphere which is in the gaseous form, it comprises of a number of gases, right? So, it will be a sum total of partial pressures which are exerted by all these gases, right? So, how you can find out the atmospheric pressure? Just by adding the partial pressures of the nitrogen, that is the partial pressure of nitrogen, Pn2, right. So, N2 is the formula for nitrogen gas, right. So, it is denoted as Pn2 plus the partial pressure exerted by the oxygen. To this you can add the partial pressure exerted by argon, also the partial pressure exerted by the water vapor and the partial pressure exerted by carbon dioxide. And apart from this, the other gases are also present in very small amount. So, all these other gases taken together, the partial pressure exerted by all these other gases taken together. So, sum of all these partial pressures will give you the atmospheric pressure, right. That is the total pressure which is exerted by this particular mixture of gases. So, how you will find out the partial pressures of the individual gas? Now, you know what is the total partial pressure of the mixture, right. So, how do you find out the partial pressure of a particular gas in a mixture of gases? Just by multiplying the total pressure exerted by the mixture with the percentage of the gas which is present in that particular mixture. So, nitrogen, as you all are all aware, it is 0.786%. So, just by multiplying it with the atmospheric pressure, you will obtain the partial pressure exerted by the nitrogen. Similarly, you can calculate it for oxygen, argon, water vapor, carbon dioxide and the other gases. So, as you can see, if you add up all these partial pressures, you will get the total atmospheric pressure, right, that is 760 millimeters of mercury. Then coming to the Henry's law. So, Henry's law, it states that the quantity of the gas that will dissolve in a particular liquid, that is proportional to the partial pressure which we have seen just now, the partial pressure of that particular gas and its solubility. Okay. So, the tendency of a particular gas to dissolve in a particular liquid, because here your gases have to dissolve in the body fluids, right. So, its tendency to dissolve in these liquids, that will be directly proportional to the partial pressure. So, greater the partial pressure, greater will be its quantity which is dissolved. So, also the solubility is very important in that particular fluid, right. So, higher the solubility, more will be the gas which will be dissolving in that particular fluid. Okay. So, in body fluids, the ability of a gas to remain in solution it is greater when its partial pressure is high as well as when its solubility in water is high, because our body fluids, they are aqueous in nature, right. So, the solubility of your gas in water should be high. So, if these two situations fulfill, then your gas will dissolve at a greater rate and amount in the body fluids. Okay, so, greater the partial pressure of the gas over the liquid, the higher the solubility, more the gas will remain in the solution. So, if you compare the oxygen with the carbon dioxide, much more carbon dioxide is dissolved in the blood plasma. That is because the solubility of carbon dioxide, it is 24 times greater as compared to oxygen. So, more amount of carbon dioxide will be dissolved in the blood as compared to the oxygen. Okay, so, with this basic knowledge about the laws of gases, so now you know what is the role of the partial pressure, what a partial pressure is, what is the role of partial pressure and the solubility of a particular gas. So, with this basic knowledge, we will start with the two types of respirations which take place. So, as we have already seen earlier, the process of respiration, it involves the exchange of gases in the body. So, it involves three steps: pulmonary ventilation, external respiration and internal respiration. So, we have already considered the pulmonary ventilation. So, we will talk about the external respiration and internal respiration in this particular video. Okay, to begin with the external respiration. So, this is also known as the pulmonary gas exchange. Why? That is because this gaseous exchange is taking place in the lungs. That is why it is also known as pulmonary gas exchange. Okay, so, what this process involves? It involves the diffusion of oxygen from the air in the alveoli to the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. So, whatever oxygen is present over here in the alveolar air, it will enter into the pulmonary capillaries. And what will happen to the carbon dioxide? It will move in the opposite direction, that is from the pulmonary capillaries, it will move into the alveolar air. Okay, so, this process of external respiration, it converts the deoxygenated blood, which is depleted of some oxygen, into the oxygenated blood, which is saturated with the oxygen. Okay, so, blood which is coming from the right side of the heart towards the lungs, it is rich in carbon dioxide, whereas it is depleted in the oxygen. So, that is the reason why this exchange of gases will take place, and this deoxygenated blood, it gets converted into oxygenated blood. So, it is rich in oxygen now and depleted in carbon dioxide. Okay, now, as this blood is flowing through these pulmonary capillaries, what will happen? The oxygen from the alveolar air, it will enter into the blood capillaries or the pulmonary capillaries, and the carbon dioxide is given out. Okay, now, you are calling this particular process as the exchange of gases. Okay, but both these processes are taking place independently. This diffusion processes for oxygen and carbon dioxide. These are two independent processes which totally depends upon the levels of oxygen across this membrane. Okay. Now, let us see why this transfer of gases in the opposite direction is taking place. What is the reason for that? So, we have seen that the partial pressure, that is the pressure which is exerted by a particular gas in a mixture, that is very important over here, right? So, the gradients across the membrane, that is very important for any gas to move across the membrane. Here your gas has to move across the membrane, right? We have seen that there is respiratory membrane, right, which the gas has to cross. So, as it have to cross this particular membrane, why it will cross it? Because there is a difference in the partial pressure across this particular membrane. So, let us understand what are the partial pressures of these two gases. So, we have to focus only on the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. Okay, so, as you can see, the atmospheric air, the partial pressure of oxygen, it is 159 mmHg, and that of carbon dioxide, it is 0.3 mmHg. But in the alveolar air, what are the partial pressures of these gases? So, partial pressure of oxygen, it is 105, and the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide, it is 40 mmHg. So, these levels in the alveolar air, these are different due to the rapid exchange of gases which are taking place. So, the air which you inhale, so by the time it reaches the alveolar air or the alveolar spaces, the partial pressure of oxygen, it is 105, and the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide, it is 40 mmHg. And what about the partial pressures of these gases in the blood, which is present in the pulmonary capillaries? So, from where this blood is coming? It is coming from the right side of your heart, right? So, this deoxygenated blood which is coming from the different tissues, it will enter the right atrium. From here it will go into the right ventricle, and right ventricle will pump it into the pulmonary trunk. From here it will go into the right and the left pulmonary arteries, and the blood will be entering into the lungs. So, this particular blood which is deoxygenated, because most of the oxygen is utilized, it is depleted in oxygen and rich in carbon dioxide. So, let us see what are the partial pressures over here. Partial pressure of oxygen, it is 40 mmHg, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it is 45 mmHg. So, in which direction the gradients are? Yes, in this particular blood over here, the partial pressure of oxygen, let us talk about oxygen. So, it is just 40 mmHg, right, but the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar air, it is 105. So, in which direction the gradient is? Obviously, from the alveolar air into the pulmonary capillaries, right. So, this is what happens normally, and if you are exercising, your level of oxygen in this blood will be even lower. the partial pressure of oxygen will be even lower because more oxygen is utilized by the contracting muscles. Okay, so this difference in the partial pressures across this membrane, respiratory membrane, will allow the diffusion of oxygen from the alveolar air towards the pulmonary capillaries. So, this diffusion will continue until the partial pressure of the oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries, it is increased to match the partial pressure of oxygen which is present in the alveolar air, that is 105. So, till this value increases to 105, this movement of oxygen will continue till there is difference in the partial pressures across the membrane. The diffusion of oxygen will continue from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. Now, why is the partial pressure of oxygenated blood 100 over here? Now, what did I tell you just now? The partial pressure of deoxygenated blood was 40. So, there is a gradient. So, this oxygen will move till the partial pressure of blood over here increases to 105. But why it is 100 now over here? That is because as these pulmonary capillaries which are present near the alveoli, so as they are leaving the lungs or the alveolar air spaces, the blood which is present over here, it mixes with small amount of blood which is flowing from the conducting portions of the respiratory system, the conducting zone, remember, nose, the trachea, larynx, pharynx, bronchi, bronchiole. So, in this case the blood from the other regions, probably from the bronchi and the bronchioles, it will add to this blood. So, now what will happen? Will the partial pressure of oxygen remain same? No. That is because the blood which is draining from these conducting regions, it is getting added to this particular blood. That is why the partial pressure of oxygen, it drops slightly and it becomes 100 mmHg. So, it is slightly lesser. When the exchange takes place, it increases to 105, but as small amount of blood is getting mixed with it, it is dropping back to 100. Now, this is to do with the movement of the oxygen from the alveolar air into the pulmonary capillaries. Now, at the same time, what will happen to the carbon dioxide? Now, in which direction the gradient for the carbon dioxide is present over here? In the deoxygenated blood, what is the level of carbon dioxide? It is 45. And what is the partial pressure in the alveolar air? It is 40. So, in which direction it will move? Yes, obviously it will move from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveolar air. Though the gradient is not as high as oxygen, but still it exists, because this level is kept up to 40 due to the exhalation. Okay. So, for how long this exchange will continue, or for how long this diffusion of the carbon dioxide will continue? Till the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillaries, it drops to 40. Okay. So, it is in equilibrium with the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air. So, till it drops to 40, this movement of carbon dioxide into the alveolar air will continue. Okay. So, this is how the oxygenated blood which is returning back to the left atrium, it has the carbon dioxide at the level of 40 mmHg. Now, what will happen when you are exercising? Okay. Now, normally this is how the exchange of gases will take place in the lungs, that is the process of external respiration will take place. Now, what happens during vigorous exercise? Now, normally the blood gets sufficient time for the exchange to take place. During vigorous exercise, the cardiac output increases, the blood flows very rapidly, right, through these pulmonary capillaries as well as systemic capillaries. So, as a result of this, the time for which the blood remains over here, it is very short, right, but still the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, it reaches 100 mmHg. So, it does not happen that the process slows down or the partial pressure of oxygen lowers down, it does not happen, it maintains its normal value. However, in case of any diseases, there may be decrease in the rate of diffusion of these gases. So, that full equilibrium of this partial pressures may not occur across these membranes. So, that the partial pressure of oxygen, it may be low, or the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide, it may be high. So, this indicates that the efficient exchange of gases is not taking place in the lungs. So, the external respiration is getting affected due to some diseases which is altering these processes of exchange of gases. So, these partial pressures of your oxygen and carbon dioxide will tell you whether your lungs are functioning properly or not. So, this to do with the external respiration. Coming to the internal respiration. So, the one which is taking place at the tissue level in between the cells and the systemic capillaries. So, the blood vessels which are supplying to the tissues are the capillaries. So, the exchange of gases which is taking place at this level, it is also known as tissue respiration or internal respiration, or it is also known as systemic gas exchange. So, the oxygenated blood which is pumped by the left ventricle into the aorta, it will be carried towards the cells of the tissue, right, through the systemic circulation. So, it will reach the systemic capillaries which are in close association with the tissues and where the exchange of gases will actually take place. So, at this level, the exchange of gases is taking exactly in the opposite direction when you compare it with the external respiration. So, here the oxygen was entering into the blood and carbon dioxide was leaving the blood, but in the case of internal respiration, the oxygen will be moving out of the blood and the carbon dioxide will be taken up by the blood. So, what will happen as a result of this? Oxygen, it leaves the blood. So, what will happen to this oxygenated blood? It will get converted into deoxygenated blood. And this particular process, it takes place throughout the body. And where does external respiration takes place? It takes place only in the lungs, whereas this process takes place in the whole body. So, let us talk about the movement of the gases. So, as we have seen earlier, the differences in the partial pressure is responsible for the movement of these gases across the membrane. So, same gradients are available over here, but in the opposite direction now when you compare it with the external respiration. So, in the oxygenated blood which is reaching the tissues, what is the partial pressure of oxygen? That is 100 mmHg, right. So, in the systemic capillaries, the partial pressure of the oxygen, it is 100, whereas in case of tissues, how much it is? It is just 40 mmHg. So, in which direction the oxygen will move? Obviously, from the capillaries into the tissues, right, because the levels of oxygen in the tissues is always low, as it utilizes the oxygen for ATP production. So, due to this difference in the partial pressures across this membrane, the oxygen will diffuse out to enter into the tissues. Now, for how long this particular process will continue? Till the partial pressure of oxygen drops down to 40, correct? Because the partial pressure of oxygen over here in the tissues, it is 40, right? So, this movement of oxygen will continue from systemic capillaries to tissues till the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood drops down to 40. So, at the same time, one more process is taking place, right. So, there is a gradient available for the carbon dioxide also. So, what is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood? It is 40. And what is it in the tissues? It is 45 mmHg. Why? Because the cells are continuously producing carbon dioxide. So, that is a gaseous waste which is produced out of several metabolic processes. So, that is why the level of the carbon dioxide is higher in the tissues, the partial pressure is higher in the tissues. So, there is a gradient in which direction? From the tissues towards the blood. So, due to this, the carbon dioxide will diffuse into the systemic capillaries till the partial pressure of the blood it increases to 45, right, because here it is 45. So, gas moves in the area of low partial pressure till it is in equilibrium in both the sides of the membrane. Okay. So, this movement of carbon dioxide will continue till the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood it raises to 45 mmHg. Okay. So, this deoxygenated blood it will be returned back to the right atrium, correct. So, it has the partial pressure of oxygen of 40 mmHg and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 45 mmHg. So, from here it will be again pumped into the pulmonary trunk and from here it will go to the lungs for the external respiration to take place. So, new cycle will begin. So, again the gaseous exchange will take place, external respiration will take place, movement of gases will take place, oxygenated blood will come back to the right atrium, from here it will go to the tissues, internal respiration will take place and so on. So, it is a cyclic process which will continue for life. Okay. So, these are the processes of external and internal respiration. Now, if you can see the amount of oxygen which is actually needed by the tissues, it is just 25%. Actually, the so called deoxygenated blood, it retains the 75% of oxygen content. Only when the tissues are exercising, they will utilize more oxygen, more than 25%. Okay, so only in the active cells it utilizes more oxygen for the ATP production. So, this will result in the level of oxygen to drop below 75 in the deoxygenated blood. Otherwise, most of the oxygen, that is the 75% of the oxygen, is actually retained in the blood. Only 25% of the oxygen is utilized by the tissues. Okay. So, these processes of the gaseous exchange which take place at these two levels, that is the pulmonary exchange and the systemic exchange. So, the speed with which they occur, it will be governed by the several factors like say partial pressure, difference of the gases, as we have seen. Higher the difference in the partial pressure, greater will be the movement of the gas across the membrane, right. Next factor is the surface area which is available for gaseous exchange. Can you all recall the surface area of the alveoli? Yes, it is round about 70 meters squares, right. So, very vast area is available for gaseous exchange. So, within fraction of seconds the exchange of gases will take place, because the area which is available is also very vast. So, greater the area available, greater will be the process of gaseous exchange. Then the next factor is the diffusion distance, that is the thickness of the membrane which is needed to be crossed. So, if this distance of diffusion, if it is smaller, what will happen? Obviously, the rate of diffusion will be faster as compared to this one, right. Then the next factor is the molecular weight and the solubility of the gas. So, smaller the molecular weight, greater will be the rate of exchange of the gases. So, for that matter, the oxygen has a lower molecular weight as compared to carbon dioxide. So, actually the oxygen rate of exchange is faster. But one more factor is the solubility, right. Solubility is also equally important. Now, which one is more soluble? We have discussed earlier, oxygen or carbon dioxide. Yes, it is the carbon dioxide which is more soluble. It is 24 times more soluble, right. Okay, so, these are several factors which can govern the gaseous exchange which can take place at the different levels, and that is the very important one which makes it possible for the gas to move across the membranes. Imagine if there was no partial pressure difference, if the area is vast, diffusion distance is also small, solubility is good, but if the partial pressure difference does not exist, what will happen? Will the gas move across the membrane? No, it will never move, because it is in the equilibrium. So, this is very important. The difference in partial pressure is very, very important for any gas to move across the membrane. So, that is the reason why the external and internal respiration is taking place. Okay. So, as we have seen, the external respiration is the movement of the oxygen from the alveolar air into the pulmonary capillaries and the movement of the carbon dioxide from the blood in the pulmonary capillaries into the alveolar air due to the differences in partial pressures across the membrane, and the internal respiration which takes place at the tissue level, which involves the movement of oxygen from the blood in the systemic capillaries to the tissues and the movement of carbon dioxide from the tissues into the blood in the systemic capillaries. So, it is repeatedly continual process, the external respiration and the internal respiration, to satisfy the needs of the body. Okay. So, this is the reference. Thank you for watching.